Welcome to the DrRcraft CSS variables tutorial. CSS variables allow definition of specific values that can be reused throughout the CSS code. It can make larger CSS code bases easier to maintain and is easier to adjust by simply changing one value instead of repetitively going through the entire CSS code. Let's learn how CSS variables are used by modifying some existing CSS code to use variables. So as you can see here, we have a very basic page with a clear color scheme in mind, and the CSS is pretty basic as well, and we're using the same color multiple times in the code, which we can change to be a CSS variable. And this would probably work best in the form of a global variable that can be referenced anywhere in our code. So the way we can define a global variable is by making use of the root pseudo class. The root pseudo class selects the outermost HTML element. So this root HTML element is what will be selected. And the way we can define a variable is using two dashes, and then we can come up with a name for our variable. So in this case, I can say primary color, as there's one color that's being used, and then you can say pale violet red as the value. And then we can change all these other instances of pale violet red to use the variable. In order to do this, you can use a new function known as the var function. And this can take in a parameter of the variable name that we've declared. So we can just copy primary color, and it will work exactly the same as it did before. And we can also copy it over to the other elements that are using the same color. So now they all have consistent color. And the reason why this is helpful is because if we want to change the color at any point, we don't have to go changing all of the color definitions in our CSS code. We can just change a single color, and it will be much easier. Next, let's learn how to prevent errors when CSS variables aren't defined in our code. This var function actively depends on this primary color variable being there. However, if we remove it, then you can see a lot of the color is now gone. However, we can fix this making use of fallback values. We can add a fallback value by going into the var function and adding a comma, and then the fallback value which we want to use if our color isn't defined. For example, you can set it to red to indicate an error. And then we can change all of our definitions to use this fallback value. So now, if the primary color variable isn't defined, then it'll just use red as the color. However, if we define it again, then it'll use that color that we put in the variable as. Finally, let's take a look at changing the variables in certain places. Local variables work in a similar way to global variables, except that instead of defining the variables in the root element, you define them in the elements that where you want the value to be different. So here I want to change the primary color for only the table, and so we can just do it in the same way by setting primary color but to something else. And now, as you can see, the table has a different color but nothing else does. And we can freely change these around to our liking. This concludes the CSS variables tutorial. Thank you very much for watching.